I know. All right, it looks like we got everybody in. Well done, woohoo! All right, guys, let's get started. So welcome to This Is Your Brain on VR, a look at the psychology of doing VR right. Let's see if this clicker actually clicks. Come on, click. Oh, I'm hitting the wrong thing. I'm just an idiot, that's all. You gonna work? You gonna work? Where am I clicking? Oh, well, we'll use the old-fashioned route. So my name is Kim. I am a research scientist and a technical designer. I know there's a little bit of confusion. Some people were like, doesn't she work at Riot Games? I do work at Riot Games. But today I'm here on behalf of Radial Games for work that I have been doing for the past probably, depending on how you measure it, anywhere from 4 to 5 years to even longer. I have a PhD in computer science specializing in artificial intelligence, and I have an honors degree in cognitive science specializing in how the brain works. I spent a lot of time thinking about how people think in games and using that, hopefully, to make stuff. So VR, huh? So I think I tweeted the other day that this will forever be the GDC before VR dropped. This is a once-in-a-lifetime event. Who knows where the hell we'll be next year? Maybe living under bridges, maybe living under fancy bridges, who knows? But it's going to be a ride. So what's the deal with VR? If you look historically back at what we have done as content creators, I know we've got a mixed audience today of game creators and folks from entertainment, and I'm so glad we're all here together because there's so much to share. We have historically, specifically in games, or particularly in games, really tried to bring the player into that experience. We have spent time taking flat screens and trying to pull people into those screens. But with virtual reality, we throw all of that out. Because in many respects, we are actually literally putting the person in the game or in the experience. And all of those things that we have done to try to pull people into those experiences don't matter anymore because they are in. They are so in. This gap, I know that's a stereo speaker, but it's just such a cool historical picture. This gap is gone. It's not even relevant anymore. So I'm working on a game called Fantastic Contraption, which some of you may have heard of. It is, oh, thank you. Team effort, team effort. I'm very blessed to be working with some of my very best friends on this project. The project is a building game. It started its life as a web game, a flash game, where you would construct objects using sticks and wheels and whatnot, and you would try to take an object toward a goal. We ported it to VR, and you can see this is actually one of our external cameras. The sheep is what you would be doing in that space. You're trying to get those pink blocks to the pink goal, building whatever sort of fantastic contraption you can come up with. These are my peeps. Wonderful mix of Northway Games, Radial Games, a shell in the pit. Sorry, guard, I love you. And a bunch of other people that have helped us get here today. So this talk is taking a look at the brain in VR specifically. I'm not going to go into a lot of super technical detail, but I'd like to hopefully open your eyes to some of the things that are going on behind the scenes so that as content developers, you can be better informed. There's quite a number of amazing talks happening at VRDC and onto the main track as well, which I hope you'll take advantage of. I know Thomas Bedank did one on the cognitive psychology of VR, and it went into some really interesting technical stuff, so I highly encourage you to check that out. I'll also be giving a second talk, technically my third talk, on Thursday on the game design in VR. So if you're interested in going into more of a deep dive in game design, allow me to pitch that talk as well. OK, let's get started, because we're going to run out of time. So I'm really just going to scratch the surface of a lot of things here. But first, we're going to start with the brain. So there's 3 key things that are important to keep in mind about the brain. The first is that your brain will work overtime to create a consistent, sensible worldview. It's going to try to make sense of this mess that is all of this information coming in at any given time. Even when it's inconsistent information, your brain does not like being inconsistent. You might have heard the term cognitive dissonance before. It will work very hard to straighten things out, which is great news if you're in VR. Because this means, most importantly, that the brain is working for us, and that we can take advantage of this if we don't get in its way. The second thing is that we can't trust our brains. Our brains are presenting to us reality at any given moment, at least our brain's interpretation of that reality. So what that means is it's taking a whole bunch of different information, some of which may seem consistent with your worldviews, etc., some of which may not, and it's rearranging and it's trying to turn it into some form of consistency. That means it may even do things like rearrange memories or present to you things that maybe you didn't actually see but you think you see with conviction, etc. Our brains essentially, in short, are always screwing with us. And we need to be mindful of that because it affects how we see the projects that we work on, how the consumers of our projects see them, and how we work with each other. And third, the brain is super gullible. We can actually trick the brain into thinking a lot of really interesting things without those things actually being there, which turns out is also helpful in games, VR, and entertainment. So let's look for a moment at an example. Let's talk about attention. So there's two big, broad categories of attention. The first is exogenous attention, or reflexive attention. This is the stuff when something pops up that you can't ignore. It's big, and it just draws your attention. Endogenous attention, on the other hand, is voluntary. It's how I direct my attention. When I'm at a cocktail party, it's how I pay attention to one conversation versus another. Or for those of you in the audience who are on your phone, it's how you're paying attention to that and not to me. It's okay, I've been there, I do it too. So we exist in this situation, though, of divided attention. Right? We are always being pulled very strongly by certain things. Some things we can't avoid at all, and other things we are trying to switch our attention to. So we're trying to kind of navigate this mess of things. And it leads to some really interesting phenomenon. So there's a very famous video that psychologists, or an experiment rather, but this is the video of the experiment. I don't actually have the video with me, but Thomas Bedank, I believe, showed it in his talk, so you can see it, where the researchers asked folks to watch these people who are throwing around a basketball and count the number of times the people wearing white shirts threw the ball. Pretty simple task. They start throwing the ball, you're watching it. Meanwhile, someone in a gorilla suit comes through. Most people don't notice the gorilla. Most people don't. And you think, no, 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 I'd notice the gorilla, because I see these things. I know I do. No, you don't. Remember, your brain? Screwing with you. You're paying attention to certain things, and there's a lot of other perceptual cues and things that would draw your attention over other things. But you're very likely to have not seen that gorilla. So we miss things. We might do the most noisy, amazing, hopefully apparent thing within our experiences that we create, but we still might miss them. There's another thing called change blindness. This is an experiment where somebody goes up to someone on the street and asks them directions. And while they're asking directions, some construction workers or folks come by holding a giant piece of board or something that otherwise obscures the person you're talking to, and they just walk right on through. And when you come out the other side, what they've actually done is they've swapped, and there's a different person that you're talking to that's giving directions. Most people don't notice. So we don't see the things that we think we see. And because of that, our world becomes malleable. We can do things with this. We can use this to our advantage to craft the kinds of experiences that we want to craft. These two balls, same size, different size. Whoa, crazy, same size, who knew? We have all sorts of interesting physical instantiations of this as well. This is a visual, obviously impossible object, but sometimes we create what seem like impossible objects in the real world. Has anyone seen an Ames room before? Yeah, lots of people nodding. So this is a room where if you look through from a particular perspective, one person looks giant and one person looks teeny. And our brain is trying to make sense of this based on prior experience. So here's a behind-the-scenes look at an Ames room. Narrative also matters. The stories we tell our players, either consciously or unconsciously, primes our players to interpret the world in certain ways. Okay, let's go on and talk about how we engage players. So first, what does it mean to be here right now in this room? It doesn't mean that you looked up on the map and you figured out we had actually changed spaces and we moved into this room and oh, I got here and yeah, I'm here, woo, I'm in my seat. This is what it means to be here, right? That's not exactly the story. Your brain is actually taking in a lot of different information to tell you that you are here right now in this space. It's visual cues. The fact that you're looking up at a stage and you look around and pretty much looks like GDC. I know they start to blur together after a few years and a few drinks, but we're definitely probably in GDC. There's the vestibular system. This is the collection of organs that measure things like acceleration, how the head is rotating, translating, its orientation in space. It's not exactly conscious, and it's never turned off, because we're always reading gravity, and you will sure know if gravity disappears. There's the proprioception system, or our body awareness. Close your eyes for a moment. Is anyone freaking out because they've misplaced their hands? Did you forget that you're sitting down right now and not standing? No. You can open your eyes now. So all of this information, the senses of position and movement, where our bodies are located in space, the effort, the force, all of these things that come together, the heaviness that plants our bottoms in our seats at this moment, that's the proprioception system talking to us. We have extension. This is how we project ourselves into the world. We may live in our minds and all this huge central processing unit that we have in our heads, but we extend and we exist physically in the world because we reach out with our hands. Our hands and how we extend in the world is a very important part of the system. One of my favorite VR experiences, Job Simulator, does this to great effect. You've got hands in this world. You're able to exist and interact with this world in a very human-like way. And all of this comes together to create a giant perceptual soup. It's a soup of shifting weights, a whole number of different signals, many, many more than I could cover today. And priorities, the things that you're focusing on at any different moment, will cause certain things to bubble up and other things to pop and disappear. All of the things that measure what your brain is paying attention to do. And this all comes together in the form of presence. So I talk a lot about VR, and every time I'm about to give a VR talk, someone comes up to me without fail, are you going to talk about presence this time? I really hope you talk about presence. I'm always going to talk about presence. So presence is exactly how it sounds. It's how we are where we are. It's our sense of being in this space, and it is that perceptual soup. It turns out, hard to get. You do not get presence for free in VR. It might seem that way because the first time you put on the head-mounted display, your visual system is screaming at you, holy shit, I'm in VR. But once you get over that, and those of you who have been working in VR for a while will know exactly what I'm talking about, other things start to bubble up, right? The makeup of the soup shifts, and that visual information is no longer as strong as it was. So it's hard to maintain. I did a study on rats wearing VR goggles, which is pretty much the cutest image in the world. And what they discovered was that even though they had this full input system, the GPS system in the rats, if you will, wasn't working. They had a terrible time navigating around the world. So there's lots of information coming in that we just can't fully replicate in a VR situation, and that does make it challenging. But we don't need to have perfect presence to make cool things. What we need is an awareness of what the relevant components are and how those things relate to the core experience that we're crafting. So let's talk about engagement. So we've probably all in this room heard the concept of flow. If you're not familiar with it, it's a very highly focused mental state. It typically arises when the challenge of whatever we are doing is perfectly matched with the skill required to do it. So if you take a look at Audio Shield, this is a game where you're holding colored shields and it's to music. Sorry, I don't have any music to go with it. And you're just basically trying to reflect these objects as they're coming down. And you get into this really great flow sense, a state. You've got music happening. It's all it feels really, really good. When you add to that as well a form of arousal, so something that's really going to grab our attention, this can be, fight or flight, it can be sexual arousal, it can just be, I'm excited about something, I'm super hyper engaged with something. And then you add to that a narrative. In other words, you give your brain a reason for why it is feeling the way that it is feeling, and it will take all of that and it will package it up into what it thinks is real, into reality. That's what immersion is. It's give you flow, hold your concentration, give your brain some form of arousal, it's awake, it's doing a thing, and explain it to the brain why this is happening. So maybe it's happening because space pirates. right? You're in a situation where you're shooting at these robots flying at you. You're definitely going to be in a flow state. You're feeling kind of excited because there's things flying at you, and there's a narrative. It doesn't have to be aggression-oriented. It could be in response to a challenge, right? You're holding a design in your head as you're building something, for example, in Fantastic Contraption, and you're fully in that space, and you're excited, and you hit go, and you watch, and you see what's happening. You are in that space. Or it could be more traditional, full-on fight or flight. What's important is that we don't have to feel like we are somewhere to be engaged. So we don't want to get too caught up in presence. Presence is neat. It's a really amazing feeling to be transported somewhere else. And I mean, when you think about the power of VR, it enables us to give everybody in the world, potentially, the opportunity to travel and see things and do things they otherwise might not have the opportunity. It's very powerful. But we don't need perfect presence. When we engage people, however, that recipe for that soup changes. When you start out in Arizona sunshine, which is a ton of fun, you're at this little camp, and there's a little barbecue in that camp area. And it's all chill. You're in this really nice Arizona, there's mountains and this really gorgeous scenery, and you're looking around, you see the barbecue, I want to go flip a burger because it's there, I want to do it. And you walk up and you can't, because it's not modeled. And I've heard the developers, and I love this, they're like, why do people want to flip burgers? I don't know, they're just there, and it's great, and I really want to flip those burgers. But the second those zombies show up, I sure as hell don't care about flipping any burgers. So my level of engagement dramatically shifts the things that I want to do in a space. So let's talk about the fidelity contract. So the fidelity contract is really the expectations that the player has of what you're able to do in a space. It's the extent to which the world behaves in the way that I think it should behave. And this is born out of a number of things. So some of it is world and physics rules. A lot of that is we are experts as human beings of navigating this world and these physics. So we bring with us a lot of expectations and a deep visceral understanding of how those systems work. If you're going to mess with that in your experience, you better be consistent, and you better give the player either opportunities to learn it themselves or teach it very well. The interactive expectations, so what should I be able to do in the world? Or the affordances, the things that the objects in the world tell me they can do. If I have a drawer that I can walk up and I can open and I can close it, and right next to it I have a drawer that I can't, you're going to break the fidelity contract. And as a player, as a consumer of that content, I'm going to feel shorted because of that. So we need to be very mindful. We set a lot of unconscious expectations, too. Things that we don't even realize as we navigate these experiences that we are expecting to be able to do. And we need to watch for those. Things that I just want to do. I really want to flip those burgers. Please, can I flip those burgers? I'm a vegetarian, so it's you know how much I really want it. Narrative expectations, right? The story that the world is telling us leads us down a particular path. There's plenty of master storytellers in here, I'm certain. You guys have an amazing craft at getting people through from one point to another to tell a story. It changes quite dramatically in VR, but it's still there. The narrative experience is still there. Even a linear narrative experience still lives in there. And there's things that you never even expected as a developer. You really need to watch. Back to Job Simulator again. Here's a really great example of a lot of these different pieces. You see the affordances of the giant button on the coffee maker. What do you want to do with that? Well, it's a button, and I have a hand. I sure as heck want to push that button, don't I? And you push it, and what happens? Oh, coffee comes out. Cool, and I have a mug, and what do I want to do with it? I want to pick it up, and I want to put coffee in it, and then I want to dump it out. I don't think I showed the dumping. Oh, just about there. I cut it a little. But you can actually dump it out. So it behaves in a way that I expect it to. The physics work in a way that I expect it to. This is a really great example of the fidelity contract. And all of these things that you see here, even though I'm not interacting with them, they all respect me as a player because I can interact with them, and they respond in appropriate ways. It's not that every game needs to be this complex. It's that in this case, this fits with the core experience and the expectations of the player. For your experience, you need to know what that is. But most importantly, it's when you break this contract, That's when the experience starts to fall apart. And you might not always know the extent of the contract that you have set up. It might be things that you don't even realize the player or user is going to try to do. So you need to watch. You need to watch very closely and see how people react in that space, see the kinds of things that they are creating. And as best you can, I've been in this industry a long time, I know it's not always feasible, but as best you can, try to reward the player by filling in those holes. Or if you can't, and you think it's going to be something that the player is continually going to feel this when it's missing, then maybe consider reworking it so that your experience doesn't lead them to believe they can do that. One of the other really challenging things that we deal with in VR, and this is true if it's standing scale, seated scale, room scale, however big scale it gets, we are going to have constraints on the amount of space with which we have to work. And as creators of content, we are going to be deeply motivated to create experiences that are so much bigger than the space we have available. And why not? There's some pretty incredibly good experiences out there right now that are way bigger than the space in which you are physically able to play them. So we have to be very clever, and we have to be very careful. And we have to, together as a group, figure out the best way to communicate these things. Because the spaces that we build, they too contribute to the fidelity contract. So here is a great game, Budget Cuts. If you haven't played Budget Cuts, it is so much fun. It is a really interesting experience where you are sneaking around through a facility trying to avoid robots. Now, this is very clearly a larger facility. How do I know? There's doors. I can see farther than where I'm standing. But there is this wall and this counter where I am that is telling me as a player there's a wall and a counter and a ledge there. And as a player, I react in a very interesting, visceral way. There's a robot in there that I sure as heck don't want to see me. And so you see the player sneaking around and looking, and they grab the plant and they throw it. They're like, oh, God, it's going to see me. They're reacting to a completely artificial space. There is no wall there. But the focus, the core experience, everything boils down to that piece, that fake wall there. And so you don't at any moment feel shorted that you're not in a bigger space. You kind of know subconsciously that you're in a bigger space, but the focus and everything is right there, and it feels fantastic. And we're experimenting as an industry with different ways of moving around. So when you do move through a larger spot, Budget Cuts has this teleport. A lot of folks have a version of teleport, where you just cast this reticle, and then you click a button, and you just warp in there. One of the neat things to call out about this, actually, is a small thing that I think makes a huge difference, is when you teleport in, if you can't see it, unfortunately the resolution's not good enough here, but when you teleport in, you're really close to the wall. And if that wall was just white, it would be super confusing, because you'd just see like, uh-oh, it broke. So what they did is they actually, I assume they swap in a texture when you get close, so that wall feels more real. So there's an example of a more visual fidelity trick, but something that contributes to how the world works and how you expect the world working. So instead of feeling like it's broken, you just see a texture and you know what it is. Okay, nausea. Whew. Everyone stick up your finger. Now pull the finger of the person next to you. No, I'm just kidding. Don't do that. Shake your finger like this in front of you. Okay. Now, shake your head if you're comfortable doing so. The first time, your finger was really blurry, right? The second time, your brain was pretty able to track it. Our brains are designed to move us through the world, not have the world move around us. It's a really important thing to keep in mind. So when we're talking about nausea, there's kind of the spectrum of nausea. It's player locomotion, I'm moving around the world. There's linear movement, where you're moving at a consistent pace with zero acceleration in a single direction. There's acceleration. There is rotation, where you're accelerating and rotating. Well, acceleration, rotation, et cetera, et cetera. And then there's both. Whoops. Why is this going through twice? Ha. There we go. So this is really important. This is huge. Results may vary. Some people are far more sensitive. I tend to be a canary in the coal mine. I get sick very easy when I am in certain experiences. That doesn't mean there's something wrong with me or something wrong with the person that doesn't get sick. What matters is that we pay attention to that variation. Because if people are going around saying this becomes the reputation of the media, not the content. This is scary for all of us. This is not to say there is wrong content if it makes you sick necessarily. There are perfectly amazing, incredible experiences that will turn my stomach. That doesn't make them intrinsically bad. But it means that we need to be conscious about how we tell people how to interact with the comfort level of what they're doing. Or everyone will start saying this, and we'll be in a really bad spot because everyone will be afraid of it. So we also have to be very careful as developers of this content that we will acclimate. We will get used to this. We will get better. We will find our sea legs or our space legs or our whatever legs, and we will get less and less sick. But as that happens, we become worse and worse predictors of how our audience will react physically. So you need to test, and you need to test very carefully. Don't ever say to someone that, oh, this definitely won't make you sick. Right? That invalidates their experience. It's better to talk instead about the level of comfort. Most people are incredibly comfortable with this. I haven't known anyone yet to get sick in this. Or, yeah, a couple people have said they're motion sick, so I understand if you maybe want to skip this one or if you want to take it carefully. And some people are going to be like, screw this, I'm in, this is great, flying in space, this is awesome. And heck, I mean, I've been known to be like, this is really fun. So there are times, but it needs to be your choice. It needs to be the consumer's choice. And we need to be very careful because this is exciting and you're all making incredible things and I want the world to see it. But I don't want to accidentally have us build up a reputation that's incorrect. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about now the player. So remember, we got these gullible brains. What we need to figure out is what are the relevant perceptual moments and design with those in mind. So you need, as content creators, to think about how the world absorbs the player or the user and what might distract them, for example. So in Fantastic Contraption, we have iterated. I'll go into a lot more detail in my talk on Thursday, but here's a little example of, remember I said you had to get this goal ball or goal object to the goal. So this is one of our tutorial moments. Tutorial beats. When we originally put this together as a way of communicating to the player the limits of the space, so this is, in particular, this is on the Vive in room scale, so you can actually move around your space. That grassy, lighter grassy patch that you see there delineates the actual walkable space as you have defined it for your rig. And we had what we call bedposts in all of the corners that delineated those boundaries. And it turned out that was a terrible idea. It was super distracting. As soon as people were panning around, they're like, ooh, what's that? And they went and they looked at it. And they wanted to interact with it. And it became a thing in their world. We're like, no, we're just helping you out so you don't walk into a wall or And people just didn't understand it. So we removed them. They turned out to be this enormous distraction. And instead, we used the simplicity of our world to communicate to people to look around. You know, they saw this neat sky, and they're kind of looking around like, oh, hello, what's this? And they'd see this ball and this spark line, and then their eyes would follow in that. And we add a little bit of text. I'll talk about that in a moment. So sometimes things don't get people's attention either. Remember the inattention and the change blindness. So we have iterated a lot on our tutorial, and it's still got a long way to go. We have a ton of, I think, opportunity to grow this into a better space. Always open to suggestions. I think there are a million better ways probably out there that we just haven't even thought of. But we went through a lot of iteration where we would have the hand vibrate, and people would be so busy looking at everything else that they wouldn't notice this. Or that at that particular moment they were preoccupied by something and would miss that beat, and therefore the message would be lost. And so we started putting things on objects as well. But then we would have people doing things, oh, wow, that was neat. I wonder what else there is. And then the message would, and they would have missed that. So the timing, all of these things are things that are challenges we are still facing. When we originally started out, our very first iteration, we had these massive signs just thunk, pop up, and leaves would spray out into space. And it was like, read me! And everyone missed them. Nobody saw. We would have people, because we could see, we'd be watching our screen, and the thing would pop up in front of them, and they'd be like, and on the sign is instructions on what to do. Like, here, do this next. And like, there's this beautifully rendered artistic Vive controller that we had on it that Lindsay Jorgensen did, and they looked great. And they'd just stand there like, I wonder what I do next. Right there. So it clearly wasn't working, and we had to swallow that and go, okay, this is fundamentally broken. And part of it was because people were there were so many other things that sign, even that big transition that we thought was a big transition, wasn't loud enough, if you will, to make it over top of all of the other interesting perceptual cues in that space. You can also nudge people's attention with diegetic cues. These are things that contribute to the story that the world is telling. They're a part of your world. They feel very much a part of your world. One of the beautiful things about this scene is actually the bridge. Look at how the bridge tells the player exactly where to look, how it tells the direction, the flow of this experience is all in this bridge. It's great. It keeps everything contained, but in a completely natural way. You can also use very careful absences. If something is too interesting, the player has no reason to look away or try something else. If you provide just too much interesting content, or you provide content that has the player in a state of fight or flight, for example, that's going to affect what's holding their attention at any given moment. You might have a very, very boring giant spider here, but it's still going to hold the player's attention. One of the things that I love about Tilt Brush is how this beautiful black canvas just invites the player to explore and hit buttons and just do things in this space. They don't need anything in here because the space is everything that it needs to be for their intended experience. Haptics are another really cool tool. These are nonverbal communication techniques that involve touch. So in one of the early Valve demos, there was a bow and arrow that was great. You could grab the arrow from your fake quiver behind you, and you could line it up, and you could draw it back. And as you drew it back, you'd feel the haptics in the hand vibrating. And you felt that tension in that bow and arrow build up, build up, build up, even though there was obviously nothing there. They can be incredibly powerful in helping your brain write a narrative. We've experimented quite extensively with them in our sticks. So when you expand a stick and whatnot, they vibrate so slightly. It's just really adding that extra level of communication to round out the experience and the veracity, the perceived veracity of that experience. But we need to be very careful, right? There is kind of, if you will, a dark side to this. Sometimes it's a funny dark side, but it's a dark side, where we can lead people to do things without intending to that they shouldn't be doing. So one of the things that we have created in our game is a helmet world. You put on this helmet, and it takes you to your menu world. I'll talk more about this on Thursday, but it's how we do saving and loading and whatnot. It's a state change. But it's done through a very literal put on a helmet. And when we have had players testing the game who put on the helmet, and we tell them, OK, now take off the helmet so that you can go back to the game, they'll take off the entire rig. They take off the whole thing. Because their brain is like, yeah, I'm wearing a thing, and this is the only thing that I can feel I'm wearing, and so unconsciously they just take it off, and then they get terribly embarrassed. Some of the stuff is pretty strong. Or in games that have counters, for example, I've given probably hundreds of demos now, and I can't tell you how many times people have been like, all right, cool, that was a great experience. I'm just going to put the controllers down on this counter that doesn't exist. You're like, no. Especially when you only had one vibe and that was your only one. Oh, God. People have also leaned on counters as well, which is even worse. Start signing waivers, just like, oh, and they're gone. Like, damn it, I wasn't watching. So we need to be careful of that, because we're not going to ship ourselves with our products. But we have a responsibility about the affordances that we are setting, at least to a certain extent. It's a collaborative responsibility, but I think we can't stick our heads in the sand. And hey, playtesting is hard. It's hard at the best of times. I mean, it's not hard in the sense that people are like, yay, games, I want to play games. Cool, yay, games. That part's easy. The hard part is getting meaningful stuff back out of it as a developer that you can roll in a productive manner into what you're creating. And VR, it gets even harder. We have what I call the reality tether. And this is kind of the cognitive load that you hold with respect to the real world. So if you are holding any kind of representation of the real world in your head as you go into VR, that is sure as heck going to interfere with your experience in VR. And it's going to get in the way of you letting go. Sometimes this comes about for a variety of reasons. It can be a literal tether. Until you're used to it, or if you're particularly nervous around it, the cord can be a constant source of irritation that keeps pulling you back into the real world. Most people, luckily, forget it pretty quickly, but not everybody does. And if you've ever stood on one of the cables sideways, believe me, that's like Lego. You don't forget that stuff easily. If we're not creating a safe space for our users as well, then they have to hold in their head the representation of where the walls are as well. And that is not something that is conducive to an immersive experience or any degree of presence. People do eventually forget, though, and the flip side of that is people punch walls, they walk into walls, and they potentially trash their homes. So we have to think about that, too. Seriously, I searched for free VR clip art. It was a couple lines down, but there was an eggplant. You tell me. There's also the white coat effect. So it's kind of like if any of you have ever done karaoke or are quivering at the thought of doing karaoke, think how great it feels to get up on a stage and sing in front of people that you don't know. This is what it can feel like to people going into VR. We have to be mindful. We have to be sensitive that we're asking a lot of people. We're saying, hey, put this big black scary thing on your head where you won't be able to see me, and trust me, it's going to be fine. I won't do a thing. No, really. It's asking a lot. The other piece we have to think about is what is left when the wow factor is gone. Like, do we actually have solid, compelling experiences that drive the player, that drive the user, that entertain the user? Or are they really just enjoying it because, wow, holy shit, I'm in VR? We have a great story where someone came in to one of our demos and they put on the rig and they got into fantastic contraption. And they were looking at the art in the sky, which again, shout out to Lindsay Jorgensen, he's a magician. And there's, oh wow, this is so great. And then the stick spawned and they grabbed the stick and they're like, oh wow, this is great, wow. Wow, thanks so much for letting me try your game. That was fantastic, thank you. And they're like, but the game, you didn't play the game. So they were just so taken aback by the experience. I know we're all hardened VR experts now, and get off my lawn, VR kids. But hopefully still somewhere in your gut or the depths of your mind, you can remember the magic that was the first time you experienced the cutting edge VR. Because that was incredible. That is why we made this. Because it's so freaking incredible, and we want to share this with the world. This is an amazing opportunity to do some incredible things. But it does mean that people are going to get caught up in it. The last thing that I want to talk about is trust and safe spaces in VR. Our players, let me reiterate, are putting their trust in us when they place themselves in the rig. And I don't just mean when we run demos, though of course in those situations. I mean even in their homes when this stuff drops and people are purchasing these experiences. They are putting our trust in us. And part of creating believable spaces is that we want people to believe in these spaces. And we want people to feel safe so that they can give in to these spaces, right? I mean, it's a collaboration. It's a conversation. If someone is uncomfortable, they won't let themselves go. And if we're contributing to that discomfort, well, it becomes our fault. But also there's a responsibility. Now, I've heard people step up and go, yeah, but Kim, it's not real. Like, come on, just get over it. It's not real. It's just VR. How bad could it be? But we're trying to make it real, right? That's what we're here for. We're trying to make experiences that people believe in, that take them to different places. We want that to happen. So while it might not be real, it's sure as heck real enough. And the potential for doing real psychological trauma is there. Physical trauma as well, people walking into walls or scaring people to the point that they have a heart attack. We don't know yet how this is going to go, but we have to be careful. We have to be mindful of this. Our players place their trust in us when they place themselves in the rig. If you take nothing away from this talk, take that away. We share responsibility in creating awareness around our experiences, and that includes not just motion sickness, but all aspects of this. This is not to say there's anything wrong with scary content. I love scary games. This is one of my favorite genres. But I want to know that it's a scary game, and it's only fair to our users that they know that it's a scary experience as well. Because imagine if somebody jumps into Fantastic Contraption, which is this very it's a whimsical, ethereal world that we've created, and we put a jump scare in there. I mean, that's not fair, right? It's not fair. And you could hurt somebody. It might be funny for 3 seconds because, oh, we really led them along. They didn't get it. But it's not cool. It's really not cool. I've seen a lot of people get really upset in VR, and it's just not cool. So I hope I've given some insight into how the brain works in a way that sheds some light on VR. This is just a surface scratching. There is a lot of stuff happening here. And so much of this depends on the content that you are all creating. I'm totally happy after this session or any time to talk with folks if you want to deep dive some of the things that you're working on, if you're concerned about some of the experiences that you're creating. Let me reiterate, this isn't to invalidate anything that anyone is working on. This is just to hopefully give you pause to think about how it is that we process these experiences and how that can affect our player, our relationship with the player, and the quality of our content. Because you can't take the brain out of VR. It's an extremely important component to how we process this experience. Thank you. I think I left time for questions, if folks should have any questions. I'm just going to drink all the water while I'm up here. Question?
Sure. I had a question about playtesting. It's a topic that's come up in, I think, nearly all of the speeches so far. Do you have any advice on what kind of size of demographic groups you might want to use for a real good playtest so that you can interpret some of these things?
Yeah, that's a really hard one. I think that the question of demographics is always a tricky one for a number of reasons, just because they tend to be fairly heavy-handed in how we partition up people, which maybe isn't always the most reflective. But that being said, they can still be a useful tool in how we grab groups. And I think we don't necessarily yet understand how demographics map into VR. I think there's a lot of things that we're still figuring out in terms of how people group themselves up with respect to those experiences. And I think the most important one that has emerged that I would call out as special perhaps to VR, or more unique to VR than perhaps general game development, would be anything to do with nausea and comfort level. Mm-hmm. So getting that spectrum. I referred to myself earlier as the canary in the coal mine. And it's a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but it's kind of true. I am very sensitive to those experiences. So if someone is unsure if something's going to trigger, I'm a really good person to test on, because I'll be able to tell you, you know what, sensitive people will not be okay with this, and it's this, this, this. So being able to grab people that exist on that spectrum, the iron stomachs as well as the not-so-iron stomachs, I think is a very important one. And then the rest of it kind of just comes down to your core experience. Who's your target audience? Who are you intending to design this for? Are you getting people in that are, if you're creating a particular type of experience, a shoot-'em-up style game, then make sure you're getting people in that are connoisseurs, if you will, of that experience. But further to that, the other piece of it is that it gets tricky because the translation of some experiences to VR is very subject to what we call the availability bias, which means we're likely to interpret it in the way that we're used to seeing it. So things can seem like they're not working, but in fact, it's just because there's not a one-to-one translation with that experience into VR, and we've had to get creative around that. So while bringing people in from that genre, for example, is important, also you want to get a broader spectrum of people too. So it's just, you want to be mindful, I guess, about the people that you're bringing in.
So you wouldn't say there's any pattern that you've seen so far based on age, gender, gaming background, anything else like that?
The biggest pattern, I would say, is just reticence to technology. Mm-hmm. So, people who get older, especially, you get a little bit more nervous about getting sick and things. You're a little bit more, I'm almost 40, and I'm like, oh, I don't know. So I definitely have seen that emerge. But typically, especially with the bleeding edge stuff, unless you've got an experience that is accelerating people or spinning people or doing things, for the most part, there's no nausea associated with it. And once people get in there, you build that trust, and they're like, oh, wow, that's really neat. This does work.
Thank you very much. It was a wonderful speech.
Thank you.
Hi. I'm not going to get that close. Yesterday, Jesse Schell predicted that by 2017, the media would blame at least one mass shooting on a VR game.
Right.
VR is currently being driven primarily by computer scientists. You're someone who straddles the world of computer science and cognitive science. How robust, how healthy is the research base for specifically how VR affects people in the same way that people have been studying now about video games for years and years?
It's a really good question. You know, the bulk, research has existed for a very long time in this area around the notion of simulators. Like, there's a lot of papers on simulator sickness and whatnot. But I would say that's definitely one gap. And regardless, I would point to it as a gap because what we are able to do today with the technology that has just emerged in the last couple days is so much more robust and so much more powerful that so many of the theories, and that includes in this domain as well, are proving to not hold water. They're just not relevant when we're able to do things at this level of quality. So I think we really need to look at it. We need to think long and hard about what long-term exposure looks like, what the psychological effects of this, what we can safely say about the power of our experiences and what that could lead to. You know, violence in video games is a challenging topic. It's a hard one to talk about. There are some people that feel very strongly across the whole spectrum. But I believe that it is a far more complex situation than that, and it can never be isolated to one series of inputs. So I think there's a risk that VR will get pigeonholed into that. But the best thing that we can do is study it and try to understand what role it does play and how we view the world and how we interact with those around us. Because on the flip side, I think it is an incredibly powerful opportunity to unify people and bring them together and share perspectives and help each other see what it's like to live in other people's shoes in a way that we've never been able to do before.
In line with that, do you have any references of any studies that are being done?
Not off the top of my head, but if you reach out to me, I'd be happy to share what I've got, what I know about for sure, or at least help find those things.
I was just curious, that was the first time I've seen the scale of nausea and the different motor movements that would trigger different people. And I was wondering how binary those were. Is it to the point where we could put something on the top of our app that says, you know, if you're rotation sensitive, don't play this. If you're acceleration sensitive, don't play this. Or is it far too muddy and not that clear?
I think it's more muddy. I placed it as a spectrum because it certainly seems to increase the likelihood that someone will get affected by it, but I wouldn't say it's a very discrete threshold of when you transition across those things. It's a hard thing to measure, and it is definitely very muddy, and it's affected by a lot of things, like is it the night after a GDC party? Probably I'm way down at the bottom of that spectrum versus other things. So you want to be very mindful, I think, of that. Should I add to it? It's an open question. I want to encourage everyone to be thinking about this because I don't know how to handle it. I think it's a bit of a marketing nightmare, but it also will deeply impact our ability to get our content to people and build trust in things. And I still want people to do flight simulators and all these cool things because they're really cool. But just as I'm not going to become a fighter jet pilot because I'm going to barf, I'm okay with that.
It would be interesting because I imagine there's techniques for combating each one of those, and they're not necessarily overlapping between the other mechanisms.
And lots of people will adjust. So if you're willing to kind of go through it, you can get through a lot of it. Not everyone will get better, but a lot of people will actually start to adjust. And that whole concept of finding your sea legs is a very real thing in VR.
All right, thank you very much. That was excellent.
Well, thank you.
In terms of visual perception, human visual perception, are there any best practices for setting up an environment so it really feels like to add to presence, but also kind of make it more interesting visually? In other words, you're in a room, but yeah, it kind of feels like the walls are over there, but then if there's something closer and kind of more in perspective, like that makes it more interesting. Also, it's like a trick that's used in 3D movies. Are those kind of best practices things that are good to do in VR for, like, say, environment art and setting up environments?
I think they're often a good place to start, but what we've been finding with VR is that people are just wholly unpredictable. You know, whereas you can use a lot of cinematography tricks and whatnot to direct players' attention, or in a video game, for example, I mean, you can fully constrain them so you can't even go that way, for example. The freedom to move around that space is something that I think that should be cherished and upheld with VR, and we want to navigate and nudge people through the design itself. So understanding what it is you are hoping that the player will do is one piece, and kind of building around that and highlighting and drawing attention in meaningful ways that are canon that are consistent with the experience you're creating is very important, is one piece of that. And then the other piece of it is just letting people go hog wild in there and just seeing what they're doing and how they're breaking the experience and seeing if you can come up with creative ways. And sometimes that means rolling with it. Sometimes it means it's just people keep doing this, so okay, we just got to accept that and figure out how to roll it into the experience or change the experience so that we don't find it breaks.
Thank you.
Hi, huge fan of Fantastic Contraption. Thanks so much for the talk.
Thank you.
But I will say this entire conversation showed almost exclusively room scale demonstrations of being able to get up and move around. And I think pretty much everybody at GDC is interested in the seated experience, whether it's the limited motion tracking of the Oculus camera or even less with a Gear VR or cardboard. So in terms, I mean, I feel like that could be a really long conversation, but in terms of the brain and with the limitations of either minor webcam tracking or zero positional tracking, what are the things that you in your work on VR have noticed that are important for people to keep mindful of as someone myself who's gotten very pukey using cardboard demos?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, good question, great question. So I've used them all extensively, and I would say for the most part everything pretty much still applies. The parts that you really want to think about is when you're in a more constrained space, extending that notion of keeping the player safe, et cetera, becomes even more important. If you are sitting at a desk and you have things where the player could hit, you've got to be mindful of that. Or if you're using, so the Oculus has the two cameras, for example, and it works great. I've done a lot of Oculus work. It's fantastic. But if I start to turn away, if my experience leads my player over here such that I occlude one of those cameras, that's kind of on me as the designer. So the one thing that I would say changes is just that we be much more mindful of where the player is in the space and the restrictions of that space, and that we don't invite them to do things that aren't really fair or that are consistent with that space, that we just really be mindful of that. But otherwise, really, everything else is still the same. Thank you for calling that out, though.
Hi there. Can you speak a little bit to the relative importance of auditory cues to your cognitive soup?
Yeah, it's a huge piece. It's one of the hard ones to get right, too, because there's all of the positional tracking and different elements, and then you've got like the attenuation and the interference, and if you add wind cues, I mean, we're not actually blowing breezes on people, at least at this moment, so some of that is lost in needing kind of a rounder picture of all of that. But I think it's really important. One of the things that we used in Contraption that I think is really neat is we originally had a little soundtrack playing in the background, which was really neat. But we eventually landed on a system where all of the different pieces within Fantastic Contraption themselves emit either a musical note or a drum hit or whatnot in a soft, really very soft fashion. And as you move around the world, you're actually generating your own soundtrack, your own unique soundtrack for everything that you build. And I'm not saying that everything needs to go down that route, but the takeaway for me from that was that having that addition of an audio beat as well when you interacted with things in tandem with haptics and all of these different pieces, I think was a huge add in terms of the perceptual soup and rounding out that experience for the player. And so I would encourage people to think, for the most part, people aren't going to go, hey, that was like 2 inches off that sound. There's an expectation of a sound, and if you meet that expectation, then you get that little like, oh, cool, that was neat. And the absence of it, in turn, can make things feel very kind of dead and lifeless. So audio is huge, very huge.
Thank you.
Thanks. Oh, sorry, I'm missing this side. I'm blind in my left eye, so I keep turning way over here to compensate. I apologize.
That's all right. My name is Mark. Thank you, Kimberly. Question. Children. Brains develop different speed, different times, things they can and cannot do. In your research, what have you learned and what is your advice that we should pay attention to as children develop? Because that becomes a very scary place if you go wrong.
Yep. So I have not worked with children, so full caveat. And I am a huge fan of doing a hell of research on that and making sure that we understand that space, because you're absolutely right. Brains are extremely malleable, and when they are developing, there's a lot of risk associated with that. There's a lot of historical studies where we've done terrible things to cats, and while they've been developing, we've taught them to, or we've had them develop in a way that doesn't detect edges so that they'll walk off edges and things like that. So the brain is super malleable, and I'm sure people are doing work in that area, though I don't specifically know of them. But I would be happy to look more into it and share some resources too.
21.
So what age?
At what age does the guidance start? Because I think as you look at where gamers start and how they grow in, if we're only targeting 18 to 21-year-olds, we miss that whole piece. So you mentioned the concern about, hey, we don't want you to feel sick. The reality is it's 10, 12, 13, and 14-year-olds that are going to start off. So as though you target one group, if you miss the other side, that concern can just flip-flop on you, and all of a sudden you've lost your goal.
So I am not a child psychologist or developmental psychologist, so I wouldn't be comfortable giving any kind of age range, but I do agree it's something we need to look at and we should pay attention to. The flip side is we might be breeding a race of superhumans if we get them in VR young enough, because the stuff they'll be able to do will be incredible. I don't know. But yeah, definitely that's not my area of expertise, but I'm so happy that you're asking that question. I think we all should be.
Yes, I'm excited about potential of VR in room scale and larger. As the technology moves along and as the price points come down, as a developer, I can't predict what the obstacles in someone's home are, and yet they are important. So I'm just curious if you have any thoughts about, I can imagine a variety of different ways when I get close to something, maybe it becomes untransparent, but then that breaks the reality of the room that they've established, and I was just wondering if you could comment on that.
Gosh, that's a hard area, eh? That's such a good question, and I think all of us who've been working on this for the last few years have been thinking about that a lot. I've worked with Valve on some things. I mean, we've all been working with Valve, those of us who've been working on the Vive, and they've been really, really great and doing a lot of experimentation around it. They've got like the chaperone walls that pop up when you move close to things. So if you're not familiar with the Vive, when you get close, so you mark out an area that is acceptable for you to move around in, and then in the game itself, there's an overlay that appears as you get too close to the wall. It's basically like a little gritty type thing. And that tells you that you've gotten too close to a wall. And it's interesting because, at first I was like, this is so brilliant, this works great, I know that the edge is here, and as a designer I'm like, okay, it's kind of jarring, but at least I'm comfortable. I'm confident as a player when I don't see that grid, I can just let loose. And it was great, and I thought that was really powerful. But as developers, we pushed our experiences to the edges because we wanted more and more and more, or we just were making bigger things. Those grids, especially in a smaller space, were there all the time, and they were annoying as heck. It's just, and before you knew it, you were desensitized to them. And I have walked full bore into the wall so many times because I just get in there, I'm like, what grid wall? So yeah, it's another really great open question that I think, again, we all need to work together. How do we deal with this? I'm not 100% sure, but I think that if we are mindful of what our experiences are telling players to do and where we're trying to suggest that they go, and we kind of try to design with that in mind, but then that's a one-size-fits-all. I mean, the cool thing about VR is it can be standing, seated, walking around, walking a little bit around. I mean, there's that whole spectrum. But whereas before, when you look at content that is on consoles and computers and whatnot, I mean, the content that matches the device is the content that matches the device. Here we have a spectrum of content for a single device, and we can no longer trust that the consumer will actually pick the right device for their setup. It's just, one size fits all, and now suddenly they're doing things. So it's an open question. I think it's a really hard one. Hi.
Hey, thanks for mentioning my talk, and great talk.
Thank you.
My question is more specific to fantastic construction, especially concerning simulator fatigue. I think you had experiments with like small scale and then the big scale, and what do you think about that?
Yeah, it's neat. So we've experimented at every scale, right down to like sitting down on the floor and playing with your blocks kind of scale, which I really like actually. It's very nice. It's been an interesting challenge, where there's so many different variables. Your height, where you sit relative to space, that contribute to you feeling like you're in that space. One of the hardest ones, I think, to set up well is this sort of seated experience where, specific to our game, I should say, you're not actually sitting at a desk, right? You're sitting at a grassy thing. And if it's projecting out of you, many people feel really uncomfortable if something clips through their body in any sense. I mean, we don't need to physically see our body to know where our body is. And so even though we're invisible in VR, we very much know we are here and that, like, our belly is here and whatnot. So putting something through there is uncomfortable. But we can't just have them drop out into space, because that is scary. And even, we have this nice little world, but if you walk up to the edge, it's sky down there, and some people are affected by that. So playing with that scale has been really hard. We can't just shrink it down and now you sit down, because even if you're sitting on the floor, you might be sitting on an edge. And the other day I was testing that and I was like, ooh, and I was inching forward because I didn't want to be sitting next to the edge. So I think part of it is it's not fair to say that one size fits all across all of these experiences, but that we have to design with it in mind and think about what the players' expectations and trust within that space are. Yeah, so that's a big part of what we've been looking at, is just what is the ground going to look like and how are we going to interact with that. And the rest of it luckily hasn't been too bad. It's just really just you shrink things down a little bit, you increase your colliders, and that's just a lot of iteration and tweaking to make sure you can grab things. Thank you.
Thanks. Hi. Great talk, thank you.
Thank you.
You mentioned pre-proprioception. What's your opinion on using avatars to aid with this?
Oh, that's a whole other talk. Avatars are really interesting. So our sense of embodiment within a space and actually being in a space is obviously dramatically affected when there's an avatar. But that's not to say that we haven't shown in studies and whatnot that we can be pulled in and feel like we're a part of that character. But it is varied. There are people that say, when you play a game like Mass Effect, or I don't know if you play third-person Fallout or whatnot, that they feel like that they are that character. But there's been a lot more studies that have shown that actually rather people feel more like they are in a very close kinship with that character as opposed to being that character. So that's the risk, I think, with an avatar is, what relationship are you building with that character? Is it supposed to be one of identity, or is it one of a closer relationship?
Just a follow-up question. So, that's the agency implied when you have an avatar. So, have you played around much with the agency implied in objects in particular?
Yeah, so tell me what you mean by agency and objects.
It's just like you have an object that's a hammer, but if you've never used a hammer before, you wouldn't know what it does. So.
Right, gotcha. So more like the kind of affordances of what that thing will do. Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. So that's where all of the interesting cultural stuff comes in as well. Like, what have you grown up being exposed to and worked with, and how does that affect how you interpret your world around you, which is always interesting and affects localization and all of those aspects. But if you're trying to build sort of a world that doesn't, a bizarro world that doesn't actually exist, I mean, you're going to have a lot of things in there that maybe people have never seen before. And I guess the one piece of advice I would say is build a world that allows and encourages people to experiment. They should feel like they're doing things in that space, however you do things in that space, and the world should reward them by giving them something, even if it's just a little vibrate or something, but that encourages them to continue to explore and just figure it out. It might not look like a hammer, but maybe I'm doing things with it, and the reaction to what I'm doing starts to teach me as a player, because that's a really rewarding experience as a player as well.
Cool. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I apologize for being the villain, but they actually asked us to
You
clear the room.
monster.
I know.
Cool. Thank you very
but
much.
If you wanted to continue, you can go out everywhere. But
Hooray!
it was a great talk.
Thank you, everybody.